Walsh, a partner in our Washington office, and he's going to return to one of the trends that Austin Hufford from the Wall Street Journal mentioned earlier in the day, which is because of various supply chain disruptions, the pendulum swinging back even more than it was previously against offshoring to perhaps at least diversifying against risk by reshoring or nearshoring. And Mike, besides his experience in private practice, brings to the table a stint recently as Chief of Staff and General Counsel of the United States Department of Commerce. So he's very up on both the business and the legal issues at this point. So with that, Mike, you're on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. We can go right into the first slide, which you will see we don't really need to spend a whole lot of time on. I think we've established that there is great stress to U.S. supply chains right now. There are semiconductors, grocery stores. There is probably not a single attendee of this webinar that has not experienced an issue with boats sitting in port for days with shipping containers costing $20,000. So I think that it is well established that we are in a time of high stress, and especially around the holidays, and it's in the news every single day. Next slide, please. So I never liked it so much at my last job when in the middle of a crisis, someone would come in and try to pitch me on some long-term changes that needed to be made that would alleviate the crisis in the future. But given where things are, that's what I'm doing today. I do not have a magic bullet that is going to get your product off boats. I don't have anything that is going to help in the near term, but in the long term, we really do need to think about supply chains. And I think it is important to start thinking about moving your supply chains closer to your customers. There are really three options that are worth discussing. There's reshoring, that's bringing everything back into the United States and doing it domestically. There's what we would there's nearshoring, which I consider Canada, Mexico, Central America, and nowadays even South America. And then there's further offshoring with diversification. This is particularly important for companies who have a lot of their supplies coming out of China. There are other countries in Southeast Asia that since COVID have been looking to get into US manufacturing business. Vietnam is probably one of the bigger ones, but Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia are all looking for business from US companies that are currently supplied out of China. Next slide, please. So let's start with reshoring. Reshoring is bringing everything back to the United States. There's a lot of big upside to coming back to the United States from overseas. Proximity to customers is probably one of the biggest upsides through the lens of this current crunch. But bigger picture, there are just fewer disruptions. Logistics are easier when your supply chain is close to you. Federal, state, local governments, all of them want your business. So there is government incentives, government assistance that may be available depending on what your line of business is. When I was at the Department of Commerce, the Select USA group within the International Trade Administration, whose mission had been primarily to attract foreign direct investment to the United States, started focusing on reshoring, and they started focusing on bringing U.S. companies that made the decision to go overseas home. And they carefully documented their efforts, and they've got some great case studies and stories that walk through the ups and downs. And so if you are thinking about it, that's a great place to start. There are benefits to your brand, made in the USA, made in America, that It means something, and it is helpful, and it could increase sales. The U.S. workforce is skilled. The U.S. workforce is highly educated. U.S. is an innovation hub. It is a great place to do business. U.S. law is predictable, particularly if you're in the business of lots of intellectual property that needs to be protected, or cutting edge advanced manufacturing. The rule of law in the United States is really second to none, and you have a lot of predictability there. Next slide, please. Now, there are issues with reshoring. It is not, it is not the answer for everyone. The biggest, one of the bigger issues, if you take government money, whether it be state, local, federal money to come back, make sure you know what the granting agency wants you to do with that money, because there may be conditions on those government incentives. There may be time commitments. There may be hiring numbers that you need to hit. So you have to know what it is you're getting into if you seek and take assistance. U.S. labor laws, they're strict. Compliance with U.S. labor laws can be expensive. It can be cost prohibitive for low-end manufacturing. So that is something to think through as well. If you are not going to be able to hire entirely locally and you need visas, you need to think through, are you ready to help with the visa application process? Are you ready to sponsor visas for foreign workers? Made in America is a stringent requirement. You need to make sure that you understand it. You need to make sure that you meet it, because you don't want to come back to the United States, call yourself made in America, find out you're not, and buy an FTC investigation out of it. So make sure, if you're looking into reshoring, that you understand those requirements. One thing that a lot of folks don't think about is whether the finished product would require a U.S. export license. This is important not only in day-to-day operations and compliance with U.S. laws, but also because if you do, and you are manufacturing a controlled product in the United States, the CFIUS concerns may limit your options should you be looking to sell your company in the future. Foreign buyers might be turned off if they're required to file a CFIUS declaration. Also, the U.S. is focused much more heavily on enforcing the Export Administration regulations, and so export licensing is top of mind for the U.S. Finally, on reshoring, particularly for folks who are in China, moving out of China is not easy. There are all kinds of hurdles that you need to clear to get out of China if you're deciding to move your factory out of there. First is under China, most employment is term contracts. If you leave before a term is up, you will be required to pay your workers for the duration of the term. And so if you're leaving 6 months into a 2-year employment contract, that employee gets the full 2 years. That could be a big expense on top of the expenses that you're already incurring by moving your operations halfway around the world. In China, you need to make sure that you lock down your intellectual property. You need to make sure that you lock down your physical property. There have been stories about IP theft that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but there have also been stories about companies unable to get their tools, to get their molds, to get their actual proprietary physical product out when they leave. Another expense to take into consideration when thinking about leaving China is that you will be required to settle all of your Chinese debts, and so it's a big amount of cash. And so that is why reshoring is not for everyone. It's not a magic bullet, but it is a thing where if you are serious and if it is something that you think makes sense for your company, it is definitely worth looking into, because there will be there is an appetite to get your business back into the United States. Next slide, please. So nearshoring is it's an interesting issue. When during my time in government, we didn't really focus on nearshoring very much because there wasn't a U.S. government agency that was equipped to tout it. But nearshoring also offers proximity to the U.S. market. Nearshoring involves lower costs than the United States, and nearshoring may involve government incentives depending on the location that you pick. The most obvious nearshoring location is Mexico. Mexico has a number of benefits to it. First, Mexico is part of the USMCA, which is the new NAFTA that was negotiated last year. And so getting goods into and out of Mexico does not involve significant additional expense in the form of tariffs. Mexican IP protection is high. Mexico has a number of free trade agreements that could enable your company to export directly from Mexico to other countries, if that is something that your company is looking to do. And Mexico has lower labor costs than the United States. Other options besides Mexico are companies that are countries that are part of the generalized system of preferences. That is the tariff schedule that allows certain products from countries that are part of the GSP to import goods duty-free. Countries in this hemisphere include Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. It is worth looking into whether, if those places are attractive to you, whether the products that you make and that you're looking to bring into the United States are part of the GSP there. The United States also has free trade agreements with nearshoring countries. They're listed here. The most interesting one on the list, I think, is El Salvador. When I was at the department, El Salvador made a very big push to be an advanced manufacturing center, a greenfield advanced manufacturing center. They were looking for U.S. government assistance in encouraging U.S. companies with business in China to move to El Salvador. Honduras also made a similar push, but again, that's not what the U.S. government really does, and so it never really went anywhere. But I'm confident that those discussions are still happening. Finally, there's interest in a large multilateral free trade agreement that covers much of North and South America. That is likely a near-term, it's more aspirational than it is concrete, but it is something to think about, especially if this nearshoring or reshoring project for your company is going to unfold over the course of a number of years. Next slide, please. Nearshoring is not a magic bullet either. Building a factory, greenfield in El Salvador, Honduras, Central America, there are risks to that. The two biggest are some corruption and bribery issues. That is still issues in some parts of Central and South America that you will need to look out for, particularly if you're making large infrastructure investments or even medium infrastructure investments. The other is local political risk, because as regimes change, so do the policies, and there are certain political parties in Central and South America, as they go into and out of power, who are less interested in having U.S. manufacturing in Central and South America. There's geopolitical risk in Central and South America. China is making a big push to gain influence in South America in particular, but also Central America. They are trying to emulate the model that they deployed very successfully to gain influence in Africa. So you will be competing, you could be competing against big China state-owned firms for contracts, for workers, and the like. Central and South American countries have differing levels of IP protection. It's important to do your due diligence on that, particularly if your manufacturing is more advanced and if it's more IP dependent. The infrastructure varies throughout Central and South America, and so if you choose a country, make sure the region of the country is equipped to support your needs, including transportation is also can be difficult. Parts of South America are quite far from the United States, and that's something to take into account, particularly if you're going down to the southern part of South America. Finally, customs and local export requirements vary throughout as well. There's corruption risk there. You have to make sure that you have trusted local partners to help you get your goods back to the United States. Next slide, please. Let's talk about offshore diversification. This is an issue that I did focus on at Commerce. Southeast Asia, in particular, Southeast Asia has always been looking to attract U.S. manufacturers, U.S. business. During COVID, that increased pretty dramatically. Spent time in Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and Indonesia to talk about how best to convince U.S. manufacturers to come and set up there and diversify out of China. The Philippines is also a spot, and Bangladesh was very interested, particularly in the textile space. So those are options to think about. The good news is that these countries are not China. So all of the risks of doing business in China are to the extent they're China focused, you can get out of there, and you won't be as exposed to the geopolitical risk and the increasing competition between the U.S. and China. But some of the major cons are that these countries are not China. One of the things that I hear a lot as I give this talk to individuals is, look, we have very specific demands that a factory in China can make at a low cost and a high volume, and there's not a factory in Vietnam that can do that. There's not a factory in Thailand that can do that, and we do not have the money or the time to build one from scratch. China does this very, very well. China has the scale, and so that can make it very difficult if you are simply moving to another region in Southeast Asia. But diversification, far offshore is diversification. It may not bring your product too much closer to you, but when China's having rolling blackouts now, issues that are China specific will not impact you as greatly if you are elsewhere in the neighborhood. Next slide, please. All right, so what's the bottom line? Something's got to give. You are going to have to make a choice here. You're going to have to see whether there are other options for your company. These decisions are company specific. It depends on what your company does, how it does it, how much of it does, the level of complexity, your market share. Everyone understands that. Look, there probably won't be a war with China, but the supply chain issues are predicted to be ongoing through at least 2022. I haven't seen a more optimistic assessment, and I haven't seen anything to indicate that things are getting better and not worse. So proximity to the United States, very important. Proximity to your customers, very important. Diversity of supply chains, very important. There are people who can help on little bits and pieces of this, but we're